Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Thank you for having this hearing. Back in 1985, I was the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee in charge of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, so that I played a role in the construction of that 1985-123 agreement. And what I worked for was the imposition of two conditions before implementation. The first was the preparation of a report examining Chinese proliferation risk, and second, presidential certification that China was following sufficient non-proliferation policies and practices. During the final floor consideration, I argued that the agreement carried high risk and that the conditions were, in fact, not as strong as they could have been, but at least it set minimal mitigation standards for non-proliferation concerns. The Reagan administration's efforts to comply with the agreement's conditions revealed substantial Chinese proliferation risk. The agreement was shelved until 1997, when the Clinton administration certified that China was not proliferating nuclear weapons or technology and moved forward to implement the agreement. And again, I disagreed because of concern about Chinese proliferation to Pakistan and Iran at that time. Together with a bipartisan group of members of Congress, I attempted to prevent the agreement from going forward. And here we are today, just as we were in 1985 and 89 and 96, 97, and 98. I have deep concerns about whether China is complying with the current 123 agreement and other non-proliferation commitments. Concerns have been raised that China may be diverting U.S. nuclear power technology to its nuclear naval program. Would such a transfer violate the peaceful use provisions of the 1985 Nuclear Cooperation Agreement?
Yes, both the current agreement and the successor agreement, it would be a violation.
Okay. During the 1990s, China supplied Iran with uranium, and during the past 3 years, both the intelligence community and the State Department have expressed continuing concern that Chinese government and private entities have proliferated technologies concerning and related to nuclear weapons to countries of concern. A glaring example of private sector proliferation is Li Fangwei, also known as Carl Li, who has been designated, sanctioned, and indicted by the United States as a serial proliferator of nuclear weapons-related technology. China has given repeated assurances that they are investigating, but reportedly have not taken enforcement action in this case. My question is, can you confirm that the United States government, including the State Department, no longer believe that entities in China are selling dual-use technologies or technologies that could assist with nuclear weapons development or delivery systems to North Korea or other countries?
No.
You cannot. Second, in light of the Carl Li case, do you believe that China enforces non-proliferation requirements on both public and private Chinese actors to the same standard as the U.S. does?
No.
In May of 2014, 5 members of the Chinese military were indicted on charges of hacking into U.S. companies' systems and stealing trade secrets. These thefts occurred in 2010 and 2011 and included information related to the Westinghouse AP1000 nuclear reactor. During the identical time frame that these thefts were taking place, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission authorized dozens of Chinese nationals to have unescorted access to 5 U.S. nuclear power plants for 2 months. Unescorted access to 5 U.S. nuclear power plants. I have been told by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that this matter remains under investigation by the Department of Justice. Can you tell me whether any of the Chinese nationals who were placed at U.S. nuclear reactors unescorted assisted or attempted to assist the efforts of the members of the Chinese military who were indicted?
I'm unable to answer a question on the connection between the two. I do know that in terms of Chinese visitors who were allowed access to operating nuclear power plants in the same way that American experts are allowed access to Chinese nuclear power plants, The NRC, I believe, has corresponded with you several times on this and noted that it is essentially not a matter of NRC approval of such
Is
foods.
do you know if the investigation has been closed?
I do not know that.
Okay. So can you give the committee a report on that, the status of that investigation and when they intend on closing the investigation? Because I think it's directly relevant to the treaty that we are now considering.
I will endeavor to get more information. Yes, sir.
I think it's very, very important. In 2013, DOD report to Congress states, quote, China is using its computer network exploitation capability to support intelligence collection against the United States diplomatic, economic, and defense industrial-based sectors that support U.S. national defense programs. I'd like you to tell me whether Chinese government entities have attempted to hack into either the Department of Energy or the Department of State.
As discussed last night, we will give you information on that soon.
General?
I agree. We'll provide you the information we have.
Yeah, I think it's very important so that we understand, especially whether or not they have tried to access nuclear weapons information from the Department of Energy or other sensitive military information, and that would be both energy and state, but also defense and other related agencies. So my concern here, Mr. Chairman, is that it's quite clear that there are entities within China who continue to sell materials that could have dual-use application into this international nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles marketplace in the same way A.Q. Khan was doing it out of Pakistan. The gentleman who I referred to and others inside of China are continuing to do the same thing today. I think it's preposterous to conclude that the Chinese government is incapable of shutting this down. I think it exists at the sufferance of the Chinese government. I think that it's absolutely critical that safeguards be put in place to make sure that there are conditions that are attached to this agreement that ensure that there is not a continued recurrence of dangerous activity that will come back to haunt our country and the world because of China's unwillingness to actually police the export of these very dangerous technologies into the hands of those who we know will endanger the world if they gain access to it. So I am not confident that I can support this agreement. I think it needs additional strengthening if we are going to be confident that the policy that we have right now doesn't help China far, far more than it's going to harm the long-term nuclear and ballistic missile nonproliferation agenda, which we put at the highest pinnacle of American public policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A little bit on Carl Lee. Carl Lee is wanted by the Department of Justice as a principal contributor of Iranian ballistic missile programs. Recent U.S. sanctions have confiscated $8.6 million in funds from Chinese bank accounts. It's linked to manufacturing and exporting missile guidance components, has extensive network of shell companies inside and outside of China to hide his activity. What they have done over time is every time we catch him, they change the name of the firm. So he's had a relationship with 12 to 26 firms, many of which were just shell companies. And again, in sending ballistic missile technology to Iran, he's had 16 aliases, multiple bank accounts, but he's kind of running this nuclear eBay out of China, you know, selling into countries in the world that we do not want to have access to these materials. We have a $5 million reward for information leading to his arrest. In April of 2014, he was charged with conspiring to commit fraud and wire fraud and bank fraud and money laundering in Manhattan. He has a large network of industrial companies based in eastern China. So the Chinese government says they can't figure this out. They can't figure out how to shut him down or guys like him. But the good news is they can figure out other things in China. They figured out how to arrest 5 women who belonged to a feminist organization last year. They figured out how to jail 44 journalists last year. They figured out how to put 27,000 Muslim minorities in the Uyghur region in prison last year. They could figure that out. That they can do. But they can't figure out Carl Lee. Just too hard for them. Maybe it's too much evidence. Huh? Too many shell companies. Too many times. On the other hand, maybe China has just subcontracted this out to the private sector. Huh? It's a trend in America for cost-cutting reasons. Maybe China has done this in order to protect the guilty, the Chinese government, the People's Liberation Army, So their fingers aren't on it, but yet they can do the favors for Iran or Pakistan or other countries. Huh? That's what I think is going on. I think it's pretty clear what's going on. When they want to crack down, they know how to crack down. They want to crack down on Facebook. They want to crack down on Twitter. They do it. It's shut down overnight. Just shut that site down. They move in. They've got military all over all of these other areas of Chinese life that they believe are threats to their regime. But when it comes to threats to a nuclear nonproliferation regime, they just shrug their shoulders. They can't figure it out. Just too hard. And the reason it's too hard is that they've subcontracted this out to Carl Lee. He'd be in prison right now. He'd be paying a big price. Pakistanis couldn't figure it out with A.Q. Khan for like 25 years. We know why. We know why he's living in a nice private residence in Pakistan, not under arrest. He was a hero, not a felon in the eyes of the establishment. That's how we're going to get in trouble here. China gets a lot out of this. China in nuclear power is a lot like the Japanese were in the automotive industry in the 1950s. We were laughing at them. But I've had the honor, very few of us can say this, I've had the honor of bailing out Chrysler twice with votes in Congress, 1979 and then again in 2009. Huh? The Japanese just kept coming. The rest of the world just kept coming. So they want this technology. They want to reverse engineer it. They want to be the big marketer of nuclear power plants. They'll use the ostensible guise of their concern about climate change. And we're going to pay a big price in the long term. So we got to start out now where we want to wind up in the long run, because it'll be prettier that way from a policy perspective, much prettier. If we insist on very tough standards now on the Chinese before we finalize anything with them. They have to prove to us that they're serious about this, that people who violate nuclear nonproliferation policy, ballistic missile policy, pay a price. And if we pretend that they can't do it, if we pretend that they don't have an authoritarian government, if we pretend that they're a capitalist and not a communist nation, which they are, with state control over everything at a certain level, then we're just going to pretend away our nuclear nonproliferation policy. So this is a big moment for us. We have to attach conditions to this that don't allow them to derive the commercial long-term benefits of having access to our top-of-the-line nuclear technology, while simultaneously turning a blind eye to what we know is a simultaneous geopolitical agenda which they have, and which is a constant throughout the last 4 or 5 decades in Pakistan, in Iran, and other places. So I guess what I would say to you is that from my perspective, we have a big responsibility here to condition this in the tightest possible way, to expect action from China and not words, to not allow the short-term diplomatic commercial interests of any administration to trump the long-term nonproliferation goals, which we all say are at the highest level. We're here today because we changed nonproliferation policy. That's why you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member had to do such a great job on this Iran resolution. we just turned a blind eye to it. We were selling 6 nuclear power plants to the Shah of Iran in 1977, 78, 79. Thank God we didn't transfer it before he fell. That was Jimmy Carter policy. So in each iteration, so far, we've kind of dodged the big bullet. But each year that goes by, every compromise of the policy, especially when we're dealing with Pakistan and Iran, we're running a big risk. And so all I can say here is I'm going to work very hard to make sure the conditions that are attached to this reflect the seriousness with which we should take the lack of seriousness that the Chinese government has evinced in their nuclear non-proliferation policy. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.